When everything was arranged for the departure, there suddenly arrived in Madras the private secretary of Swamiji's disciple, the Raja of Khetri, bearing the happy news of the birth of a royal son. The Swami was earnestly desired to bless the heir apparent. He consented, and the Raja was overjoyed to see him. At Khetri, an incident occurred that the Swami remembered all his life. He was invited by the Maharaja to a musical entertainment in which a Nach girl was to sing, and he refused to come, since he was a monk and not permitted to enjoy secular pleasures. The singer was hurt and sang in a strain of lamentation. Her words reached the Swami's ears. She sang, "Look not, O Lord, upon my sins. Is not the same sightedness thy name? One piece of iron is used inside the holy shrine, another for the knife held in the butcher's hand. Yet both of these are turned to gold when touched by the philosopher's stone. Sacred the Jamuna's water, foul the water in the ditch. Yet both alike are sanctified once they have joined the Ganga's stream. So, Lord, look not upon my sins. Is not same-sightedness thy name?" The Swami was deeply moved. This girl, whom society condemned as an impure prostitute, had taught him a great lesson. Brahman, the ever pure, ever free, and ever illumined, is the essence of all beings. Before God there is no distinction of good and evil, pure and impure. Such pairs of opposites become manifest only when the light of Brahman is obscured by Maya. A sannyasin ought to look at all things from the standpoint of Brahman. He should not condemn anything, even a so-called impure person. The Swami then joined the party with tears in his eyes and said to the girl, "Mother, I am guilty. I was about to show you disrespect by refusing to come to this room, but your song awakened my consciousness." The Swami assumed, at the Raja's request, the name of Vivekananda, and the Raja accompanied him as far as Jaipur, where he departed for Bombay. On his way to Bombay, the Swami stopped at the Abu Road station and met Ramananda and Turiyananda, his brother disciples. He told them about his going to America, and the two brother disciples were greatly excited. He explained to them the reason for his going, saying it was for India's suffering. "I traveled all over India, but alas, it was agony to me, my brothers, to see with my own eyes the terrible poverty of the masses, and I could not restrain my tears. It is now my firm conviction that to preach religion amongst them without first trying to remove their poverty and suffering is futile. It is for this reason, to find means for the salvation of the poor of India, that I am going to America." Addressing Turiyananda, he said, "Brother, I cannot understand your so-called religion." His face was red with his rising blood. Shaking with emotion, he placed his hand on his heart and said, "But my heart has grown much, much larger, and I have learned to feel. Believe me, I feel it very sadly." He was choked and then fell silent. Tears rolled down his cheeks. Many years later, Turiyananda said while describing the incident, "You can imagine what went through my mind when I heard these pathetic words and saw the majestic sadness of Swamiji. I thought, were not these the very words and feelings of Buddha?" And he remembered that long ago Naren had visited Bodh Gaya and in deep meditation had felt the presence of the Buddha. Another scene of the same nature, though it occurred much later, may be recounted here. Swami Turiyananda called on his illustrious brother disciple after the latter's triumphant return, that is, Vivekananda's return from America, at the Calcutta home of Balaram Bose, and found him pacing the veranda alone. Deeply immersed, he did not notice Turiyananda's presence. He began to hum under his breath a celebrated song of Mirabai, and tears welled up in his eyes. He stopped and leaned against the balustrade and hid his face in his palms. He sang in an anguished voice, repeating several times, "Oh, nobody understands my sorrow. Only he who suffers knows the depth of my sorrow." The whole atmosphere became heavy with sadness. The voice pierced Swami Turiyananda's heart like an arrow, but he could not understand the cause of Vivekananda's suffering. Then he suddenly realized that it was a tremendous universal sympathy with the suffering and oppressed everywhere that often made him shed tears of burning blood. And of these the world would never know. The Swami arrived in Bombay accompanied by the private secretary to the Raja of Kitri, the prince having provided him with a robe of orange silk, an ochre turban, a handsome purse, and a first-class ticket on the SS Peninsular of the Orient Company, which would be sailing on 31st May, 1893. The Raja had also bestowed on him the name by which he was to become famous, and which was destined to raise India in the estimation of the world. The ship steamed out of the harbor on the appointed day, and one can visualize the Swami standing on its deck, leaning against the rail and gazing at the fast-fading landscape of his beloved motherland. What a multitude of pictures must have raced at that time through his mind. The image of Sri Ramakrishna, the Holy Mother, and the brother disciples, either living at the Varanagore monastery or wandering through the plains and hills of India. What a burden of memories this lad of 29 was carrying. The legacy of his noble parents, the blessings of his master, the wisdom learned from the Hindu scriptures, the knowledge of the West, his own spiritual experiences, as well as India's past greatness and her present sorrow, as well as also the dream of her future glory, the hopes and aspirations of millions of India's brown men toiling in their brown fields under the scorching tropical sun, the devotional stories of the Puranas, the dizzy heights of Buddhist philosophy, the transcendental truths of Vedanta, the subtleties of the Indian philosophical system, the soul-stirring songs of the Indian poets and mystics, the stone carvings and the frescoes of the Ellora and Ajanta caves, the heroic tales of the Rajput and Maratha fighters, the hymns of South Indian Alwars, the snow peaks of the towering Himalayas, and the murmuring music of the Ganga. All these and many such thoughts fused together to create in the Swami's mind the image of Mother India, a universe in miniature, whose history and society were the vivid demonstration of her philosophical doctrine of unity in diversity. And could India have sent a son worthier than Vivekananda to represent her in the Parliament of Religions? A son who had learned his spiritual lessons at the feet of a man whose very life was a Parliament of Religions. A son whose heart was big enough to embrace the whole of humanity and to feel for all in its universal compassion. Soon the Swami adjusted himself to the new life on board the ship, a life completely different from that of a wandering monk. He found it a great nuisance to look after his suitcases and trunk and wardrobe. His orange robe aroused the curiosity of many fellow passengers, who, however, were soon impressed by his serious nature and deep scholarship. The vessel plowed through the blue sea, pausing at various ports on the way, and the Swami enjoyed the voyage with the happy excitement of a child, devouring eagerly all he saw. In Colombo, now Sri Lanka, he visited the monasteries of the Himalayan Buddhists. On the way to Singapore, he was shown the favorite haunts of the Malay pirates, whose descendants now, as the Swami wrote to an Indian friend, under the Leviathan guns of modern turreted battleships, have been forced to look about for more peaceful pursuits. The Swami had his first glimpse of China in the busy port of Hong Kong, where hundreds of junks and dinghies moved about, each with the wife of its boatmen at the helm, for a whole family lived in each floating craft. The traveler was amused to notice the Chinese babies, most of whom were tied to the backs of their mothers, while the latter were busy either pushing heavy loads or jumping with agility from one craft to another. And there was a rush of boats and steam launches coming in and going out. Baby John, the Swami wrote humorously to the same friend, is every moment in danger of having his little head pulverized, pigtail and all, but he does not care a fig. The busy life seems to have no charm for him, and he is quite content to learn the anatomy of a bit of rice cake given to him by the madly busy mother. The Chinese child is quite a little philosopher and calmly goes to work at the age when your Indian boy can hardly crawl on all fours. He has learnt the philosophy of necessity too well from his extreme poverty. At Canton, in a Buddhist monastery, the Swami was received with respect as a great yogi from India. He saw in China and later in Japan many temples with manuscripts written in the ancient Bengali script. This made him realize the extent of the influence of India outside her own borders and strengthened his conviction about the spiritual unity of Asia. Next, the boat reached Japan and the Swami visited Yokohama, Osaka, Kyoto, and Tokyo. The broad streets, the cage-like little houses, the pine-covered hills, and the gardens with shrubs, grass plots, artificial pools, and small bridges impressed him with the innate artistic nature of the Japanese people. On the other hand, the thoroughly organized Japanese army, equipped with guns made in Japan, the expanding navy, the merchant marine, and the industrial factories revealed to him the scientific skill of a newly awakened Asiatic nation. But he was told that the Japanese regarded India as the dreamland of everything noble and great. His thoughts always returned to India and her people. He wrote to a disciple in Madras, "Come out and be men. India wants the sacrifice of at least 1,000 of her young men. Men, mind you, and not brutes. How many men, unselfish and thoroughgoing men, is Madras ready to supply? And who will struggle on to death to bring about a new state of things? Sympathy for the poor, bread for hungry mouths, enlightenment for the people at large. who have been brought to the level of beasts by the tyranny of your forefathers. From Yokohama, he crossed the Pacific Ocean and arrived in Vancouver, British Columbia. Next, he traveled by train to Chicago, the destination of his journey and the meeting place of the Parliament of Religions. The first sight of Chicago, the third largest city of the new continent, the great civic queen of the Middle West, enthroned on the shore of Lake Michigan, with its teeming population and strange way of life, a mixture of the refinement of the eastern coast and the crudities of the backwoods, must have bewildered, excited, and terrified the young visitor from India. Swami Vivekananda walked through the spacious grounds of the World's Fair and was speechless with amazement. He marveled at what the Americans had achieved through hard work, friendly cooperation with one another, and the application of scientific knowledge. For not too many years before, Chicago had consisted of only a few fishermen's huts, and now, at the magic touch of human ingenuity, it was turned into a fairyland. Never before had the Swami seen such an accumulation of wealth, power, and inventive genius in a nation. In the fairgrounds, he attracted people's notice. Lads ran after him, fascinated by his orange robe and turban. Shopkeepers and porters regarded him as a Maharaja from India and tried to impose upon him. On the Swami's part, his first feeling was one of unbounded admiration, but a bitter disillusionment was to come. Soon after his arrival in Chicago, he went on one day to the Information Bureau of the Exposition to ask about the forthcoming Parliament of Religions. He was told that it had been put off until the first week of September. It was then only end of July, and that no one without credentials from a bona fide organization would be accepted as a delegate. He was told also that it was then too late for him to be registered as a delegate. All this had been unexpected by the Swami, for not one of his friends in India, the enthusiastic devotees of Madras, the Raja of Kitri, the Raja of Ramnad, and the Maharaja of Mysore, the ministers of the native states, and the disciples who had arranged his trip to America, had taken the trouble to make any inquiries concerning the details of the Parliament. No one had known what were to be the dates of the meetings or the conditions of admission, nor had the Swami brought with him any letter of authority from a religious organization. All had felt that the young monk would need no letter of authorization, his personality being testimonial enough. As his Irish disciple, Sister Nivedita, wrote some years later, "The Swami himself was as simple in the ways of the world as his disciples, and when he was once sure that he was divinely called to make this attempt, he could see no difficulties in the way. Nothing could have been more typical of the lack of organization of Hinduism itself than this going forth of its representative unannounced and without formal credentials to enter the strongly guarded door of the world's wealth and power." In the meantime, the purse that the Swami had carried from India was dwindling, for things were much more expensive in America than he or his friends had thought. He did not have enough to maintain him in Chicago until September. In a frantic mood, he asked help from the Theosophical Society, which professed warm friendship for India. He was told that he would have to subscribe to the creed of the society. But this he refused to do because he did not believe in most of the theosophical doctrines. Thereupon the leader declined to give him any help. The Swami became desperate and cabled to his friends in Madras for money. Finally, however, someone advised him to go to Boston, where the cost of living was cheaper, and in the train his picturesque dress, no less than his regal appearance, attracted a wealthy lady who resided in the suburbs of the city. She cordially invited him to be her guest, and he accepted, to save his dwindling purse. He was lodged at Breezy Meadows in Metcalfe, Massachusetts, and his hostess, Miss Kate Sanborn, was delighted to display to her inquisitive friends this strange curiosity from the Far East. The Swami met a number of people, most of whom annoyed him by asking queer questions regarding Hinduism and the social customs of India, about which they had read in the tracts of Christian missionaries and sensational writers. However, there came to him a few serious-minded people, and among these were Mrs. Johnson, the lady superintendent of a women's prison, and J.H. Wright, a professor of Greek at Harvard University. On the invitation of the superintendent, he visited the prison and was impressed by the humanitarian attitude of its workers towards the inmates. At once there came to his mind the sad plight of the masses of India, and he wrote to a friend on 20th August, 1893. How benevolent the inmates are treated, how they are reformed and sent back as useful members of society. How grand, how beautiful. You must see it to believe it. And oh, how my heart ached to think of what we think of poor, the low in India. They have no chance, no escape, no way to climb up. They sink lower and lower every day. They feel the blows showered upon them by a cruel society, and they do not know whence the blows come. They have forgotten that they too are men, and the result is slavery. Ah, the tyrants! You do not know that the obverse is tyranny, and the reverse, slavery. Swami Vivekananda had no friends in this foreign land, yet he did not lose faith. For had not a kind providence looked after him during the uncertain days of his wandering life? He wrote in the same letter, "I am here amongst the children of the Son of Mary, and the Lord Jesus will help me." The Swami was encouraged by Professor Wright to represent Hinduism in the Parliament of Religions, since that was the only way he could be introduced to the nation at large. When he announced, however, that he had no credentials, the professor replied, "To ask you, Swami, for your credentials is like asking the sun about its right to shine." He wrote about the Swami to a number of important people connected with the Parliament, especially to the chairman of the Committee on Selection of Delegates, who was one of his friends, and said, "Here is a man more learned than all our learned professors put together." Professor Wright then bought the Swami a railroad ticket for Chicago. The train bearing Vivekananda to Chicago arrived late in the evening, and he had mislaid, unfortunately, the address of the committee in charge of the delegates. He did not know where to turn for help, and no one bothered to give information to this foreigner of strange appearance. Moreover, the station was located in a part of the city inhabited mostly by Germans, who could hardly understand his language. He knew he was stranded there, and looking around saw a huge empty wagon in the railway freight yard. In this he spent the night without food or a bed. In the morning he woke up smelling fresh water, to quote his own words, and he walked along the fashionable Lakeshore Drive, which was lined with the mansions of the wealthy, asking people the way to the Parliament grounds. But he was met with indifference. Hungry and weary, he knocked at several doors for food and was rudely treated by the servants. His soiled clothes and unshaven face gave him the appearance of a tramp. Besides, he had forgotten that he was in a land that knew thousands of ways of earning the almighty dollar, but was unfamiliar with Franciscan poverty or the ways of religious vagabonds. He sat down exhausted on the sidewalk and was noticed from an opposite window. The mistress of the house sent for him and asked the Swami if he was a delegate to the Parliament of Religions. He told her of his difficulties. The lady, Mrs. George W. Hale, a society woman of Chicago, gave him breakfast and looked after his needs. When he had rested, she accompanied him to the offices of the Parliament and presented him to Dr. J. H. Barrows, the President of the Parliament, who was one of her personal friends. The Swami was thereupon cordially accepted as a representative of Hinduism and lodged in the house of Mr. and Mrs. John B. Lyons. Mr. and Mrs. Hale and their children, as well as the Lyons, became his lifelong friends. Once again, the Swami had been strengthened in his conviction that the Lord was guiding his footsteps, and he prayed incessantly to be a worthy instrument of his will.